Welcome back, everyone. Today we're getting into something heavy, something that'll make you rethink a lot about the country we live in. See, every nation has secrets it would rather keep hidden, but some of those secrets, well, they're more like entire graveyards. This isn't going to be an easy ride. We're talking about operations that sound like they came straight out of a science fiction novel. Experiments that crossed every ethical line you can think of. Massacres that got erased from the history books. Government programs that went after their own citizens. And here's the thing that really gets you. These aren't wild theories from the internet. These are documented, declassified, proven historical facts. The kind of stuff that makes you realize sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. So, grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's walk through 15 of the darkest moments in American history. Trust me, by the time we're done, you'll understand why some secrets stayed locked away for decades. Chapter 1. MKUltra, the CIA's mind control nightmare. Let's start with something that sounds completely crazy. Imagine if I told you that the CIA spent more than 20 years secretly giving drugs to American citizens, trying to figure out mind control techniques, and running psychological experiments that would make a mad scientist uncomfortable. You'd probably think I was losing it, right? Well, buckle up, because MKUltra is very, very real. It all started in 1953, right in the middle of Cold War fears. CIA Director Allen Dulles had just given a speech about Soviet brain warfare, about how American prisoners of war were coming back from Korea, acting like zombies, repeating communist messages. He was scared that the Soviets had found some kind of drug or method for taking over people's minds, and in classic Cold War thinking, his answer was to say, "We need to get there first." On April 13, 1953, Dulles signed off on a program called MKUltra. The goal: find a truth serum. Develop better ways to question people, figure out if he could actually control someone's mind. It was run by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, and over the next 20 years, this man would oversee some of the most disturbing experiments ever done on American soil. Here's where it gets wild. The CIA bought up the entire world's supply of LSD in the early 1950s, spending $240,000, which was a huge amount back then. Gottlieb then started sending it out to universities, prisons, hospitals, and research centers through fake front companies. The test subjects were often people who had no clue they were part of a CIA experiment. We're talking about prisoners like Whitey Bulger, the famous crime boss, who was given LSD every single day for over a year. He later described it as living through absolute hell, hallucinating, seeing blood coming out of walls, watching people turn into skeletons right in front of him. The whole time, he thought he was volunteering for a study on schizophrenia. Nope. Just the CIA seeing what happens when you pump someone full of acid for months on end. But it wasn't just prisoners. The CIA set up safe houses in New York and San Francisco where they'd drug completely unsuspecting citizens. They'd hire prostitutes to bring men back to these apartments, then slip them LSD and watch what happened through two-way mirrors. And I'm not talking about trained doctors monitoring this. I'm talking about CIA agents with zero medical background, just taking notes while people had complete mental breakdowns. The experiments went way beyond LSD, we're talking electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, and various forms of psychological torture. They tested these methods on thousands of people across 44 universities, 12 hospitals, and 3 prisons. Schools like Stanford, Harvard, and Georgetown were involved, often without the wider academic community knowing. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. When penicillin became available as a treatment, or when effective therapies came along, they didn't offer them to the test subjects. Why? Because treatment would ruin the experiment. They wanted to see what happened when you completely broke someone's mind. One of the saddest cases was Frank Olson, an army scientist working on the program. In 1953, he was secretly given LSD by his CIA co-workers during a retreat. Days later, he jumped out of a hotel window in New York. For years, this was covered up as a suicide. It wasn't until the 1970s that the truth came out. He'd been drugged without knowing it, and the psychological effects drove him to his death. Now, you might be thinking, surely someone noticed this was happening and put a stop to it, right? Wrong. In 1963, the CIA's own Inspector General wrote a report noting that testing on unwitting subjects was unethical. You know what happened? They just made it more secret. The program officially continued until 1973. And here's the really frustrating part. In 1973, as investigations were heating up, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Just burn it all. Make it disappear. The only reason we know as much as we do is because some financial records were misfiled and survived. When Congress finally held hearings in 1977, they uncovered 149 smaller projects. But because the records were destroyed, they could only confirm the details of a fraction of them. CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified that he was horrified by what had been done. Sidney Gottlieb, the man who ran the whole show, admitted that it probably wasn't a very successful program. You know, after 2 decades of destroying lives and running illegal human experiments, the craziest part, MKUltra's methods didn't stay buried. They found their way into CIA interrogation manuals. The same sensory deprivation methods tested at McGill University ended up documented in the Kubark Manual, which was used to train interrogators for decades. Fast forward to the 2000s, and you've got enhanced interrogation techniques at Guantanamo Bay that look suspiciously similar to what was tested in the 1950s. Oh, and remember how the CIA bought all that LSD to develop mind control drugs? They accidentally helped create the psychedelic revolution. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, got his first LSD through an MKUltra experiment. So did Allen Ginsberg. So did Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. The CIA literally helped fuel the 1960s counterculture movement that was dedicated to opposing everything they stood for. The irony is almost funny. Almost MKUltra represents one of the darkest periods in American intelligence history. It shows what happens when paranoia, secrecy, and a belief that the ends justify the means come together. Thousands of lives were destroyed, families were torn apart. And for what? The CIA's own assessment concluded that mind control wasn't possible. The legacy of MKUltra is still felt today. It's why there's deep distrust of government experiments. It's why we have strict ethics boards for human research. It's a reminder that just because something is done in the name of national security doesn't make it right. Chapter 2. Operation Northwoods. When the Pentagon planned to attack America. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you found out that the highest levels of your own military had drawn up detailed plans to attack American citizens, blow up American ships, and stage terrorist attacks on American soil, all to trick the public into supporting a war? You'd probably think that's the plot of a thriller novel, something Tom Clancy would write. But in 1962, this wasn't fiction. It was a real plan signed off by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's called Operation Northwoods, and it's one of the most disturbing documents in American history. Here's the background. It's 1961, and the Bay of Pigs invasion just went terribly wrong. The CIA trained Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro, and it was a complete disaster. President Kennedy is embarrassed. The military is furious, and Castro is sitting in Havana, stronger than ever, with support from the Soviet Union. The Pentagon is desperate to finish what they started. There's just one problem. The American public doesn't support invading Cuba. Why would they? Cuba hasn't attacked us. So, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, came up with a solution. What if Cuba did attack us? In March 1962, they drafted a document called Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It's better known as Operation Northwoods. And let me tell you, when you read this thing, it's chilling. The plan included staging a series of fake attacks that would make it look like Cuba was going after the United States. We're not talking about vague ideas here. These were detailed step-by-step proposals. Here's one. They wanted to paint a drone aircraft to look like a civilian passenger plane, fill it with fake college students, have it send out a Mayday signal claiming it was under attack by Cuban fighter jets, then blow it up. They'd stage a funeral with fake victims, create casualty lists that they specifically noted would cause a helpful wave of national indignation, and use that anger to justify war. Another proposal involved blowing up an American ship in Guantanamo Bay. They literally wrote, "We could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba." They even said casualty lists in US newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. They were planning to kill American servicemen to start a war. They also proposed staging attacks on Cuban refugees in Miami, having CIA operatives dressed as Cuban agents carry out terrorist attacks in American cities, and creating a fake Cuban terror campaign in Washington, D.C. Think about that. The Pentagon wanted to bomb Washington to blame Cuba. The plan even included sinking boats full of Cuban refugees, attacking Guantanamo Bay with forces disguised as Cuban fighters, and staging riots near the American embassy in Havana. Every detail was worked out. It wasn't some wild brainstorming session. It was a formal military proposal, with the signatures of the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, I need to add something important here. Recent historical research has made this story a bit more complicated. It turns out that the idea of creating a reason to intervene might have actually come from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother. Records show that in early 1962, RFK's group specifically asked for proposals that would serve as a believable reason for intervention in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs were essentially responding to orders from the Kennedy administration's Operation Mongoose program, which was the larger secret war against Castro. So, while Operation Northwoods is often described as rogue military officers going crazy, it's more accurate to say they were giving the administration what it asked for, even if they went way too far. Regardless of who started it, the plan was presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962. And here's where the story gets a tiny bit less terrifying. President Kennedy rejected it. He said no. He wasn't going to approve staging terrorist attacks on American citizens to justify a war. General Lemnitzer, who had signed off on these proposals, was quietly removed from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Shortly after, Kennedy sent him off to be Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, basically as far away from Washington as possible, without actually firing him. The plan was shelved, locked away, classified as top secret, and there it stayed for 35 years. The documents weren't declassified until 1997, when the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board released them. When historians first saw these files, they were shocked. The public was shocked. This was the American military we were talking about, not some terrorist group. Operation Northwoods is terrifying because it shows how far officials were willing to go. These weren't low-level workers or fringe elements. This was the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military authority in the country, unanimously agreeing that killing American citizens was an acceptable price for reaching foreign policy goals. It also raises uncomfortable questions. If they were willing to plan this in 1962, what other plans have been drawn up that we don't know about? What other operations have been proposed behind closed doors? The fact that this plan existed and was seriously considered should make everyone a little more skeptical when governments claim they'd never do such things. The legacy of Operation Northwoods is complicated. On one hand, it never happened. The system worked. Civilian leadership said no, and American citizens weren't killed to create a war. On the other hand, the fact that it was even proposed, that military leaders thought it was a good idea, that everyone signed off on it, that's deeply disturbing. It's also worth noting that Operation Northwoods has become a reference point for conspiracy theorists, who point to it as proof that governments stage fake attacks. Whether or not you believe specific modern conspiracy theories, Northwoods proves that such plans have been seriously considered at the highest levels of government. So next time someone says the government would never do that, remember Operation Northwoods. Remember that in 1962, they absolutely would have if the president had said yes. Chapter 3. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. 40 years of medical evil, alright. We need to talk about one of the most horrific medical experiments ever conducted in the United States. And I'm not talking about some isolated incident or a rogue doctor. I'm talking about a 40-year program run by the United States Public Health Service, a major part of the federal government, that deliberately watched black men die from a treatable disease just to see what would happen. It's called the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, and it's the kind of evil that makes you question how anyone could think this was acceptable. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service set up shop in Macon County, Alabama, near the Tuskegee Institute. They recruited 600 black men, 399 of whom had syphilis, and 201 who didn't, to serve as a control group. Now, syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that, left untreated, causes devastating health problems. Everything from heart disease to blindness, to insanity, to death. The stated goal was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in black males. Let that sink in. Not to treat it, not to cure it, to watch what happens when you let it destroy someone's body. The men recruited for this study were poor sharecroppers. Most couldn't read or write, and they had almost no access to health care. The researchers told them they were being treated for bad blood, which was a catch-all term in the area that could mean anything from anemia, to fatigue, to syphilis. The men thought they were getting medical care. They weren't. They were being studied like lab rats. In exchange for participating, the men received free medical exams, free meals, and $50 for burial expenses, which was significant money during the Great Depression. But here's what they didn't receive: actual treatment for syphilis. Now, when this study started in 1932, there was already a treatment available. It wasn't great. It involved arsenic-based compounds that had serious side effects, but it worked. The Public Health Service chose not to provide it. Their whole justification was that treating the men would ruin their ability to study untreated syphilis. But it gets so much worse. In 1947, penicillin was discovered and became widely recognized as a safe, effective cure for syphilis. By the early 1950s, penicillin was the standard treatment. Guess what the Public Health Service did? Nothing. They didn't tell the men about penicillin. They didn't offer it to them. In fact, they actively worked to prevent them from getting treatment. In 1934, just 2 years into the study, researchers provided local doctors with lists of the men in the study and specifically asked them not to treat them. In 1940, they did the same thing with the Alabama Health Department. In 1941, when many of the men were drafted into World War II and their syphilis was discovered during military entrance exams, the researchers stepped in to get them disqualified from service. Why? Because the military would have treated their syphilis, and that would have interfered with the study. Let me be crystal clear about what this means. The United States government actively prevented black men from receiving life-saving medical treatment so they could watch them suffer and die. This wasn't passive observation. This was active interference to make sure the subjects stayed sick. The study continued for 40 years. Throughout this time, researchers published academic papers about their findings. Papers that appeared in medical journals every few years. Nobody raised ethical concerns. Nobody questioned whether letting people die from a treatable disease might be, wrong. In 1965, a Public Health Service epidemiologist named Peter Buxton came across information about the study and was horrified. He went to his superiors and said, "This is unethical. We need to stop this." He was told the study would continue until all the subjects were dead. He tried again in 1966 with the CDC. Same response. Finally, in 1972, Buxton went to the press. The Associated Press broke the story, and public outrage was immediate. Congressional hearings were held in 1973. The numbers that came out were devastating. By the time the study ended, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. Another 100 had died from complications related to the disease. At least 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis, passed from their fathers. All of this could have been prevented with a simple shot of penicillin that cost pennies. In 1974, the government settled a class action lawsuit for $10 million, which honestly feels insultingly low. The surviving participants got $37,500 each. The heirs of the deceased got $15,000. The affected family members got between $5,000 and $16,000. No amount of money could undo what had been done. It wasn't until 1997, 25 years after the study ended, that President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. In his speech, he said what the government did was deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was a betrayal of trust, not only to the men who participated, but to their families and the African American community as a whole. The Tuskegee experiment didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built on a foundation of scientific racism that was widespread in the early 20th century. Many researchers genuinely believed that black people were biologically inferior, more likely to get diseases, and less capable of making medical decisions for themselves. This fake science was used to justify all sorts of horrible practices. The legacy of Tuskegee is still felt today. It's a major reason why there's deep distrust of medical institutions and research among African Americans. When you tell someone that their community was experimented on for 40 years by the government, why would they trust public health officials? This has directly affected vaccination rates, clinical trial participation, and healthcare access. The study also led to major changes in research ethics. We got institutional review boards, requirements for informed consent, and protections for vulnerable groups. The Belmont Report, published in 1979, laid out basic ethical rules for research with human subjects, all directly inspired by Tuskegee. But here's something that makes this even more disturbing. In 2010, we learned that the same research group that ran Tuskegee had also deliberately infected hundreds of people in Guatemala with syphilis in the 1940s without their consent. Prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients. They were intentionally given the disease to test prevention methods. The lead researcher, Dr. John Cutler, also worked on Tuskegee. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment is a stark reminder that evil doesn't always look like a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. Sometimes it looks like doctors in lab coats, government officials filing paperwork, academics writing research papers. It's the kind of evil that becomes routine. Evil that's justified through fake scientific reasoning and wrapped in the language of progress. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it went on for 4 decades while people knew about it. published papers about it, and nobody stopped it until a whistleblower forced it into public view. Chapter 4. Operation Paperclip. How America Embraced Nazi Scientists. So, imagine it's 1945, World War II has just ended. The world has just learned the full extent of Nazi atrocities, the concentration camps, the genocide, the horrific medical experiments. The Nuremberg trials are about to begin, where Nazi leaders will face justice for crimes against humanity. And what does the United States government do? They secretly recruit over 1,600 Nazi scientists and engineers, give them new identities, erase their war crimes from the record, and bring them to America to work on government research programs. This is Operation Paperclip, and it's one of the most morally compromised decisions in American history. The name comes from the paperclips that were literally attached to the files of Nazi scientists to mark them for recruitment. The operation was run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and it began even before the war officially ended. American military intelligence was already identifying which German scientists they wanted to grab before the Soviets got to them. Here's the justification. The Cold War was starting. The Soviet Union was also scooping up German scientists. The US government decided that having these scientists work for America was better than having them work for the Soviets. National security outweighed moral concerns about hiring people who had recently worked for Hitler. But let's be clear about who we're talking about. These weren't just random scientists who happened to live in Nazi Germany. Many of them were active participants in the Nazi regime. Some were members of the Nazi Party. Some had used slave labor from concentration camps. Some had conducted experiments on prisoners. The most famous example is Wernher von Braun, who became the face of NASA's space program. Von Braun was the brilliant engineer behind the V-2 rocket program. He also used slave labor from the Mittelbadura concentration camp, where approximately 20,000 prisoners died building his rockets. When Allied forces liberated the camp, they found conditions so horrific that even hardened soldiers were traumatized. Von Braun knew about the conditions. He visited the facilities. There are reports of him selecting which prisoners would work on his projects. But after the war, all of that was quietly swept under the rug. His Nazi Party membership was downplayed. His use of slave labor was forgotten. Instead, he became an American hero, the architect of the Saturn V rocket that put men on the moon. And he wasn't alone. Kurt Blome, who conducted experiments involving plague and other biological agents on concentration camp prisoners, was recruited for the US Army Chemical Corps. Hubertus Struggold, known as the father of space medicine, conducted experiments at Dachau that involved subjecting prisoners to extreme conditions. Arthur Rudolph, who managed the Mittelbadura factory where V-2 rockets were built, became a US citizen and received NASA's highest honor before his Nazi past caught up with him and he fled to Germany. The initial policy for Operation Paperclip explicitly said that Nazi Party members and active participants in Nazi atrocities should not be recruited. But in practice, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency actively helped clean up the records of scientists they wanted to bring over. Files were sanitized. Nazi ties were minimized or erased entirely. War crimes were conveniently forgotten. President Truman had originally set strict limits on who could be brought over. He didn't want hardcore Nazis coming to America. But the intelligence agencies and military largely ignored his orders. They made up new backgrounds, created fake employment histories, and lied about how involved these scientists were with the Nazi regime. By the time the program officially ended in 1990, Operation Paperclip had brought over 1,600 scientists and their families to the United States. They worked at NASA, at military research facilities, at universities. They helped develop America's rocket program, its missile defense systems, its chemical and biological weapons research. The moral thinking behind Operation Paperclip was simple. We need their knowledge. Therefore, we'll overlook what they did to get that knowledge. It's a practical argument. The ends justify the means. The problem with that logic is that it meant the United States government was actively shielding war criminals from justice. Think about what message this sent. The United States had just fought a war against Nazi Germany. A war justified by opposing fascism and defending human rights. Americans had liberated concentration camps. Soldiers had seen firsthand the horrors of the Holocaust. And then the government turned around and said, well, but these particular Nazis are useful to us, so let's give them jobs and new identities. The hypocrisy is staggering. At the same time, America was putting lower-level Nazis on trial at Nuremberg. At the same time, we were condemning the entire Nazi regime as evil. We were secretly employing Nazi scientists who had directly participated in that same regime's crimes. Operation Paperclip also meant that many Nazi war criminals never faced justice. They got comfortable lives in America instead of prison cells or worse. The slave laborers who built rockets under brutal conditions never saw the people responsible held accountable. The concentration camp prisoners who were experimented on never got justice because the experimenters were given American citizenship and government positions. The most cynical part, the Soviets were doing the exact same thing. Operation O-Soviet-Kim brought hundreds of German scientists to the Soviet Union. Both superpowers decided that winning the Cold War was more important than confronting Nazi evil. When Operation Paperclip was finally exposed to the public in the 1970s and 1980s, there was outrage. Investigations revealed the full extent of how records had been falsified and war crimes covered up. Some of the scientists were stripped of their honors. Arthur Rudolph voluntarily left the US in 1984 rather than face denaturalization proceedings. But most of the scientists who came over through Paperclip lived out their lives comfortably in America, their Nazi pasts largely forgotten. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is complicated. On one hand, there's no question that these scientists contributed to American technological progress. The space program, missile defense, aviation all benefited from their knowledge. America beat the Soviets to the moon, in part because of German engineering expertise. On the other hand, it represents a deep moral failure. The United States government decided that expertise was more valuable than justice. That winning the Cold War mattered more than holding war criminals accountable. That the ends justified the means, even if those means included giving safe shelter to people who had participated in genocide. Operation Paperclip is a reminder that history is messy, that governments make compromises that would horrify ordinary citizens, and that sometimes the good guys make decisions that are anything but good. Chapter 5. COINTELPRO, the FBI's War on Civil Rights. Let me tell you about one of the most extensive domestic surveillance and disruption programs in American history. A program where the FBI didn't just watch activists and civil rights leaders, but actively worked to destroy their lives, break up their organizations, and in some cases set them up for violence and assassination. It's called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, and it represents one of the darkest periods in FBI history. COINTELPRO officially ran from 1956 to 1971, though similar tactics continued unofficially for years after. The program was created under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and its stated purpose was to watch, infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt domestic political organizations that Hoover considered threatening to national security. Now, when you hear disrupt domestic political organizations, you might think we're talking about terrorists or violent extremists. Right? Nope. COINTELPRO targeted civil rights groups, anti-war activists, socialist organizations, feminist groups, and basically anyone who challenged the way things were. The targets included the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panther Party, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the American Indian Movement, anti-Vietnam War groups, feminist organizations, and even individual activists and journalists. The methods used were absolutely chilling. The FBI didn't just observe these groups. They actively worked to tear them apart from the inside. We're talking about planting fake evidence, spreading rumors, sending anonymous letters to create distrust, making up fake documents, using informants to encourage illegal actions, and working with local police to harass and arrest activists. One of the most common tactics was called snitch jacketing, where the FBI would spread false rumors that certain members of an organization were FBI informants. This would cause paranoia, internal conflicts, and sometimes violence, as groups turned on their own members. The FBI knew exactly what they were doing. They were deliberately trying to tear these organizations apart from the inside. They also used the media as a weapon. FBI agents would plant fake stories in newspapers, create anonymous propaganda, and work with friendly journalists to smear activists. They'd send letters to activists' employers trying to get them fired, to landlords trying to get them evicted, to spouses trying to break up marriages. The FBI infiltrated groups with undercover agents and informants who didn't just gather information. They actively worked to disrupt activities, cause infighting, and in some cases encourage illegal actions that would lead to arrests. They wanted to prevent the rise of what Hoover called a Black Messiah who could unite the civil rights movement. The scope of COINTELPRO was massive. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI carried out thousands of secret operations. They opened over 500,000 investigative files on Americans and groups. They infiltrated hundreds of organizations, and the majority of the targets were simply exercising their constitutional rights to free speech. free assembly, and political organizing. Now, some people might say, well, maybe some of these groups were dangerous. Maybe surveillance was justified. But here's the thing. The FBI's own documents showed that most COINTELPRO operations targeted legal, non-violent activities. The goal wasn't to stop actual crimes. It was to silence political disagreement and keep things as they were. COINTELPRO remained secret for 15 years. It was only exposed in 1971 when a group of activists calling themselves the Citizens, commissioned to investigate the FBI, broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole documents and leaked them to the press. And suddenly the American public learned that their own government had been waging war on civil rights activists. The revelations led to congressional investigations, the most notable being the Church Committee in 1975. The committee's findings were damning. They concluded that COINTELPRO violated constitutional rights, that the FBI had overstepped its authority, and that the program was fundamentally un-American. The FBI officially ended COINTELPRO in 1971, after the media documents were released. But similar tactics continued through other programs and methods. The structure and mindset remained, just under different names, and with slightly more oversight. The legacy of COINTELPRO is still felt today. It's a major reason why many Americans, particularly in marginalized communities, distrust federal law enforcement. It showed that the FBI could be used as a weapon against political opponents, and it raised deep questions about the balance between national security and civil liberties. COINTELPRO proved that sometimes the greatest threat to freedom doesn't come from outside enemies, but from the very institutions meant to protect us. Chapter 6. The Wilmington Massacre, America's only successful coup. Here's a question for you. Has there ever been a successful coup in the United States? You'd probably say no, right? American democracy has been stable. Transitions of power have been peaceful. We've never had a government violently overthrown. Well, you'd be wrong. Because in 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, white supremacists carried out a violent coup that overthrew a legally elected biracial government, killed an unknown number of black citizens, and destroyed the most prosperous black community in the South. And for decades, this was celebrated as a return to proper government. It's called the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, and it's one of the most successful acts of domestic terrorism in American history. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1890s, about 30 years after the Civil War ended. During Reconstruction, black Americans had made incredible political progress in the South. They were voting, holding office, and taking part in government. In Wilmington, which at the time was North Carolina's largest city, black citizens and white Republicans had formed a coalition government. This wasn't some radical takeover. This was democracy working as it should. Wilmington had black aldermen, police officers, firefighters, and business owners. The city's population was about 56% black, and they had political representation that matched their numbers. The city was doing well economically. The port was busy. Businesses were successful, and the black community, which came to be known locally as Black Wall Street, was thriving. There were black-owned newspapers, including the Wilmington Daily Record, run by Alex Manly, successful black businesses, and a growing black middle class. But to the white supremacist Democratic Party, this was unacceptable. They couldn't accept black political power or economic success. So, they decided to take it back by force. In the months leading up to the November 1898 elections, white supremacist leaders launched a propaganda campaign. They spread lies about black criminality, stirred up fears, and openly called for white rule. Democratic Party leaders, like Alfred Moore Waddell, gave speeches calling for violence, if necessary, to bring back white supremacy. The campaign worked. Through intimidation, vote fraud, and violence at the polls, Democrats won the state elections in November 1898, but that wasn't enough for the Wilmington white supremacists. Even though they'd won statewide, the Wilmington city government was still run by the biracial coalition. Legal elections for city positions wouldn't happen until 1899. They decided they couldn't wait that long. On November 10, 1898, 2 days after the election, white supremacist leaders organized what they called the Wilmington Race Riot, though it was actually a planned coup. At dawn, somewhere between 500 and 2,000 armed white men, many of them part of a paramilitary group called the Redshirts, gathered at the armory. Their first target was Alex Manly's newspaper, the Wilmington Daily Record. Manly had written an editorial criticizing lynching and challenging white supremacist views, which made him enemy number one. The mob marched to the newspaper office and burned it to the ground. Then the violence spread throughout black neighborhoods. Armed white men went street by street, shooting black residents, burning homes and businesses, and terrorizing the black community. Black people who tried to defend themselves were shot down. The mob had Gatling guns and rifles, many borrowed from local arsenals. The coup plotters then marched on City Hall. They forced the mayor, the entire board of aldermen, and the police chief to resign at gunpoint. They installed their own government, with Alfred Moore Waddell as mayor. This wasn't an election. This was a violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. Meanwhile, the killing continued. Black residents fled into the swamps surrounding Wilmington to escape the violence. Some hid in cemeteries. Others tried to leave the city entirely. White mobs patrolled the streets, shooting any black person they came across. They went door to door in black neighborhoods, dragging people out of their homes. The exact death toll has never been determined. The official count at the time was 14, but that's almost certainly a huge undercount. Modern historians estimate anywhere from 60 to 300 black residents were killed. Bodies were found in the river, buried in unmarked graves, or simply disappeared. Many families never found out what happened to their loved ones. In the aftermath, the new white supremacist government forced prominent black citizens and white Republicans to leave the city. They gave them hours to get out of town or face death. Successful black business owners, community leaders, and anyone who might organize resistance were put on trains at gunpoint and sent out of North Carolina. An estimated 2,700 black residents permanently fled Wilmington. The economic impact on the black community was devastating. Black-owned businesses were destroyed or taken over. Black professionals lost everything they'd built. The successful black middle class that had been growing was wiped out overnight. And here's what makes this even more frustrating. Nobody was held accountable. Not a single person was arrested for the violence. Not one person was charged with murder. The federal government, which had the power to step in under Reconstruction-era laws, did nothing. President McKinley remained silent. Instead, the coup was celebrated. White newspapers praised the restoration of proper government. The new all-white democratic government was officially recognized. The coup plotters weren't criminals. They were heroes who had saved their city from black rule. For decades, this massacre was taught in North Carolina schools as the Wilmington Race Riot, as if it had been some sudden outbreak of violence, rather than a carefully planned overthrow of the government. It was presented as an unfortunate incident, where both sides were to blame, or even as a justified response to black aggression that never actually happened. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians began seriously re-examining what happened in Wilmington. In 2000, over a century later, a state-commissioned report finally called it what it was: a coup d'état, the violent overthrow of a legitimately elected government. The Wilmington Massacre had national consequences. It sent a clear message throughout the South that white supremacists could use violence to overturn elections and nobody would stop them. It showed that the federal government would not protect black citizens' constitutional rights, and it demonstrated that terrorism worked. In the years following Wilmington, similar violence and voter suppression spread across the South. Jim Crow laws were passed, black voting rights were taken away, and white supremacy was legally established for the next 70 years. The success of the Wilmington coup encouraged white supremacists everywhere. The massacre also represents the end of Reconstruction's promise. After the Civil War, there was a brief moment when it seemed like true racial equality might be possible, when black Americans might genuinely take part in American democracy. Wilmington showed that white supremacists would use any means necessary to prevent that, including overthrowing the government itself. Today, the Wilmington Massacre is finally being remembered and taught accurately. There are memorials, historical markers, and educational programs. But for over a century, this successful coup was erased from American history, or worse, celebrated as a return to proper order. It's a stark reminder that democracy is fragile, that voting rights must be constantly protected, and that white supremacist violence has deep roots in American history. Chapter 7: The Tulsa Race Massacre, the Destruction of Black Wall Street. Let's talk about what was once the wealthiest black community in America. A thriving neighborhood with black-owned businesses, theaters, newspapers, hotels, and a growing middle class. A place that was so successful, it was nicknamed Black Wall Street. And then over the course of 24 hours, in 1921, white mobs destroyed it all, killed hundreds of people, and burned 35 square blocks to the ground. This is the Tulsa Race Massacre, and for decades, it was literally erased from history books. The Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was extraordinary. In the early 1900s, while most black Americans faced severe segregation and economic hardship, Greenwood was flourishing. The neighborhood had over 300 black-owned businesses, including restaurants, grocery stores, theaters, a hospital, a school system, and even its own bus line. There were black lawyers, doctors, dentists, and business owners. The district had its own newspaper, the Tulsa Star. There were luxury shops, jewelry stores, and a thriving entertainment district. Some residents were genuinely wealthy, with nice homes, cars, and successful businesses. It wasn't called Black Wall Street as a joke. It was one of the most successful black communities in the entire country. How did this happen? Well, after Oklahoma became a state in 1907, oil was discovered nearby. The oil boom brought wealth to the region, and black residents of Greenwood were able to share in this prosperity in ways that were unusual for the time. Segregation meant that black dollars stayed within the black community, circulating through black-owned businesses and creating a self-sustaining economy. But this prosperity also created resentment among white Tulsans. The idea that black citizens could be successful, could own businesses, could live in nice homes, challenged the racial order that white supremacists were determined to maintain. The spark that destroyed Greenwood came on May 30, 1921. A 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in the Drexel building operated by a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page. What exactly happened in that elevator is unknown, but most historians believe Rowland simply stumbled and accidentally stepped on Page's foot or grabbed her arm to steady himself. Whatever happened, Page screamed. Rowland ran. Someone called the police, and by the next morning the Tulsa Tribune was running a sensationalized story claiming that Rowland had attacked Page. The headline read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." This was the powder keg. By that afternoon, Dick Rowland had been arrested and was being held at the courthouse. A white mob began gathering outside, and rumors spread that they were planning to lynch him. By evening, the mob had grown to over 1,000 people. Meanwhile, in Greenwood, black residents heard about the lynch mob. A group of about 75 armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, went to the courthouse to protect Rowland. They offered to help the sheriff guard the prisoner. The sheriff refused and told them to go home. As tensions escalated, a white man tried to disarm a black veteran. A shot was fired, and then all hell broke loose. The initial confrontation at the courthouse ended with the black defenders retreating to Greenwood, but the white mob didn't break up. Instead, it grew. By the early morning of June 1st, white rioters had armed themselves and were moving toward the Greenwood district. What happened next was not a riot. It was a massacre. Thousands of white Tulsans, including members of the local National Guard, police officers, and citizens who had been given special permission to carry weapons, invaded Greenwood. They went house to house, looting and burning. They shot black residents in the streets. They set fire to homes, businesses, churches, schools, everything. Eyewitnesses reported that airplanes flew over Greenwood, dropping incendiary devices and shooting at people trying to escape. This was possibly the first aerial bombing of an American city by Americans. Survivors described firebombs being dropped from planes, setting whole blocks on fire. Black residents who tried to flee were shot. Those who tried to defend their homes were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Firefighters who responded to put out the fires were turned away at gunpoint. The white mob wanted Greenwood to burn. By the time it was over, 35 square blocks had been completely destroyed. Over 1,250 homes were burned. All 300-plus black-owned businesses were destroyed. Churches, schools, hospitals, libraries, everything that made Greenwood a community was reduced to ash. The official death toll was listed as 36, but that's an obvious lie. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were dumped in the Arkansas River. Survivors reported seeing dump trucks full of corpses. Modern estimates suggest that between 100 and 300 people were killed, though the exact number will never be known. Over 10,000 black residents were left homeless. Thousands were rounded up and held in detention camps, some for as long as 8 days. They weren't allowed to leave unless a white person vouched for them. Think about that. American citizens held in camps by their own government, needing white sponsors to be released. The destruction was estimated at over $1.5 million in 1921, which is roughly $27 million today. But the real economic impact was far greater. Generations of wealth were destroyed. Businesses that had taken decades to build were gone in hours. Family heirlooms, property deeds, savings all burned. And here's the kicker. Insurance companies refused to pay out. They classified the destruction as a riot, which wasn't covered by insurance policies. So black homeowners and business owners got nothing. They'd lost everything and had no way to rebuild. In the immediate aftermath, There was a brief moment where it seemed like there might be accountability. A grand jury was convened. But instead of indicting the white mob, they blamed black residents for the violence. Not a single white person was ever convicted for the murders, the arson, or the looting. Even worse, the city government passed a fire ordinance that made it impossible for black residents to rebuild. The new rules required expensive building materials that most couldn't afford. There were efforts to take the Greenwood land through eminent domain and redevelop it for white businesses. The black community fought back. They hired lawyers, challenged the rules, and slowly began rebuilding. But Greenwood never fully recovered. The wealth that had been built up over decades was gone. The thriving business district never reached its former glory. And then, for decades, the massacre was erased from history. It wasn't taught in Oklahoma schools. It wasn't mentioned in textbooks. Newspaper archives from that day mysteriously disappeared. Survivors were told not to talk about it. There was a shared effort to pretend it never happened. It wasn't until the 1990s that serious efforts began to document what had occurred. In 1997, the Oklahoma legislature set up a commission to study the massacre. In 2001, on the 80th anniversary, the commission issued a report detailing what happened and recommending reparations for survivors and descendants. As of 2021, on the 100th anniversary, there were still 3 living survivors. They testified before Congress, sharing their childhood memories of fleeing the violence, of watching their neighborhood burn, of losing family members. They were asking for recognition, for justice, for reparations that never came. The Tulsa Race Massacre represents one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. It wasn't just a sudden riot. It was an organized attack on a successful black community by a white mob that couldn't handle black prosperity. It's also a powerful example of how history can be erased. For 70 years, this massacre was actively hidden. Oklahoma students didn't learn about it. Most Americans had never heard of it. It took decades of work by historians and activists to bring this story back into public awareness. The destruction of Black Wall Street had ripple effects that are still felt today. It set back black economic progress in Oklahoma by generations. It sent a message to black communities everywhere that prosperity could be violently taken away. And it's a reminder that racial violence wasn't just about lynchings and segregation. It was about crushing black success whenever it appeared. Chapter 8. The FBI's War on Martin Luther King Jr., targeting America's moral leader. Alright, let's talk about one of the most shameful chapters in FBI history. We've already covered COINTELPRO, but there's one target who deserves his own chapter because of just how far the FBI went to destroy him. I'm talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., arguably the most important civil rights leader in American history. A man who would win the Nobel Peace Prize. A man who preached nonviolence and love. And the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, decided he was a threat that needed to be taken. DOW. J. Edgar Hoover had a personal hatred for Martin Luther King Jr. He called King the most dangerous Negro in America. He believed King was influenced by communists, though the FBI's own investigations found no evidence of this. But facts didn't matter to Hoover. He was determined to destroy King's reputation and influence. The FBI's campaign against King began in the late 1950s and grew stronger throughout the 1960s. It included wiretapping, bugging hotel rooms, infiltrating the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, spreading false rumors, and sending anonymous threatening letters. The amount of surveillance was staggering. The FBI wiretapped King's home phone and office phones. They bugged his hotel rooms whenever he traveled. They tracked his movements, his meetings, his personal life. They recorded thousands of hours of conversations. But the FBI wasn't just gathering information. They were actively trying to destroy King. They sent information about King's personal life to newspapers, though most refused to publish it. They sent anonymous letters to his wife Coretta, trying to break up his marriage. They created fake documents to cause distrust within the civil rights movement. The most disturbing example came in 1964. Shortly after King won the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI sent King an anonymous package containing a tape recording of him in a hotel room with a woman who was not his wife, along with a threatening letter. The letter, which has been confirmed to have come from the FBI, was written to look like it came from a disappointed supporter. It called King evil and a fraud, and then it strongly suggested that King should kill himself before his secrets were revealed. The letter said, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days. Let me be crystal clear about what this means." The Federal Bureau of Investigation sent a letter to a Nobel Peace Prize winner telling him to take his own life. This wasn't rogue agents. This was an official FBI operation, approved at the highest levels. King recognized the letter for what it was: an attempt at blackmail and intimidation. But imagine the psychological impact. You're fighting for civil rights, trying to change America for the better, and your own government is sending you suicide letters and threatening to ruin your reputation. The FBI also worked to prevent King from receiving honors and recognition. They tried to stop the Pope from meeting with him. They tried to convince universities not to give him honorary degrees. They sent damaging information to the Nobel Prize Committee. They contacted potential donors to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, trying to cut off funding. Hoover's personal vendetta became so extreme that even other FBI officials thought he'd gone too far. But Hoover had been FBI director since 1924. He had information on everyone in Washington, and nobody was willing to challenge him. The FBI's efforts to discredit King continued right up until his assassination in 1968. And even after his death, the FBI kept files on King sealed, presumably containing the most damaging material they'd collected. When the Church Committee investigated the FBI in the 1970s, they were appalled by what had been done to King. The committee's report stated that the FBI's actions were unworthy of a free society and represented a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed at destroying King's reputation and effectiveness. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The FBI's campaign against King wasn't secret within the government. People knew what was happening and did nothing. President Johnson knew about the wiretaps. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had approved some of the initial surveillance. Congress didn't stop it. The FBI's argument was always that King might be influenced by communists, that he was a security threat. But their own investigations found no evidence of this. The real reason was that King was effective. He was changing America. He was challenging the racial status quo. And Hoover couldn't tolerate that. Think about what King accomplished, despite all of this. While dealing with constant FBI harassment, surveillance, and attempts to destroy him, he led the Montgomery bus boycott, organized the March on Washington, helped pass the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and inspired millions of Americans to fight for equality. The FBI threw everything they had at him, tried to drive him to suicide, tried to destroy his marriage, tried to cut off his funding, tried to discredit him in every way possible. And he kept going. He kept organizing, kept speaking, kept fighting for justice. After King's assassination in 1968, there were immediate conspiracy theories that the FBI was involved. While there's no credible evidence, the FBI directly took part in the assassination. They certainly created an environment where violence against King seemed inevitable. They painted him as a dangerous radical. They made his protection harder, and they celebrated his enemies. In 1999, a civil trial found that King's assassination was the result of a conspiracy involving government agencies, though this finding has been questioned by later investigations. What's undeniable is that the FBI spent years trying to destroy King, and when he was murdered, they weren't exactly heartbroken. The FBI's war on Martin Luther King Jr. represents one of the darkest abuses of government power in American history. It shows how law enforcement agencies can be turned against citizens exercising their constitutional rights. It shows that being right, being moral, being on the side of justice doesn't protect you from your own government if you threaten the way things are. Today, we honor King with a national holiday. We quote his speeches, we celebrate his legacy. But we need to remember that while he was alive, his own government tried to destroy him. The FBI surveillance of King continued, even as he became one of the most respected figures in the world. The files on King's surveillance were supposed to be sealed until 2027, but many have been released through Freedom of Information Act requests. What we've learned is damning enough. What remains sealed is presumably even worse. The FBI's treatment of Martin Luther King Jr. is a reminder that domestic surveillance and political harassment aren't just abstract concerns. They're tools that have been used against some of America's greatest heroes, and if they could be used against someone like King, they can be used against anyone. Chapter 9. The CIA's crack cocaine scandal. Dark Alliance. Alright, imagine if I told you that the CIA knew about and possibly helped the trafficking of cocaine into American inner cities during the 1980s, that the crack epidemic that devastated black communities might have been fueled by drug money that was used to fund an illegal guerrilla war in Central America. You'd probably think that sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? Well, in 1996, journalist Gary Webb wrote a series for the San Jose Mercury News, claiming that the CIA was partly responsible for bringing crack cocaine to the United States in the 1980s. The series was called Dark Alliance, and it sparked one of the biggest controversies in journalism history. Here's the background. In the 1980s, The Reagan administration was obsessed with fighting communism in Central America. In Nicaragua, the leftist Sandinista government had taken power, and the CIA was backing a counter-revolutionary group called the Contras to overthrow them. The problem? Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which stopped the US government from funding the Contras. So, how do you fund a secret war when Congress says you can't? Well, according to Webb's investigation, the CIA looked the other way, while Contra supporters smuggled massive amounts of cocaine into the United States, primarily into Los Angeles. Webb discovered that a San Francisco-based drug ring, which had ties to a CIA-sponsored Nicaraguan Contra group called the FDN, sold cocaine to a dealer in south-central Los Angeles. The key players were Danilo Blandin, a Nicaraguan exile with an MBA in marketing, who became the Contra's cocaine broker, and Norwin Meneses, described as an international drug lord. They sold tons of cocaine to Freeway Rick Ross, who became the king of crack in Los Angeles. Here's what made this so explosive. In the early 1980s, cocaine was expensive, a drug for the wealthy. But then someone figured out how to turn cocaine powder into crack, a smokable form that was cheap, incredibly addictive, and could be sold in small amounts. Suddenly, cocaine wasn't just for rich people anymore. It flooded into poor black neighborhoods. Webb's investigative series, Dark Alliance, claimed that the CIA turned a blind eye to the cocaine trafficking of the Contra army it had created and supported. And this drug smuggling into the United States helped to fuel the crack epidemic of the 1980s. The timing was devastating. Between 1982 and 1989, crack cocaine transformed American inner cities. Gang violence exploded as rival groups fought over drug territory. Addiction rates skyrocketed. The justice system responded with mandatory minimum sentences that were absurdly harsh, particularly for crack versus powder cocaine. Black communities were devastated by both the drugs and the mass incarceration that followed. And according to Webb, all of this was made possible because the CIA protected drug traffickers, who were funneling money to the Contras. Law enforcement agencies knew about the drug trafficking, but were told to back off because these dealers had CIA connections. When Dark Alliance was published in August 1996, it exploded. The story attracted hundreds of thousands of readers to the newspaper's website, at a time when going viral was still a new concept. The black community was outraged. Congressional hearings were demanded. CIA Director John Deutsch made an unprecedented trip to south-central Los Angeles to hold a public forum where he was confronted by angry residents who felt their community had been deliberately destroyed. But then came the backlash. And this is where the story gets complicated and disturbing in a different way. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times attacked the series, at times on the basis of claims that Webb did not actually make. The major newspapers, which had largely ignored evidence of CIA drug connections for years, suddenly put massive resources into discrediting Webb. The Los Angeles Times put 17 reporters on the story to tear it apart. They published a 3-part series that challenged Webb's estimates and conclusions. The Washington Post and New York Times piled on. The attacks focused on details. Webb had said millions in drug profits went to the Contras. The newspapers said his evidence showed less. Webb had described connections between the drug ring and the CIA. Critics said he was claiming the CIA directly ordered the trafficking. Webb's own newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News, gave in to the pressure. In a front-page column, the paper's executive editor, Jerry Seppos, said that the series fell short of his standards. Webb was moved to a suburban bureau in what was widely seen as a humiliating demotion. He resigned shortly after. Here's the thing though. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report on these claims. And while the report denied direct CIA involvement in drug trafficking, it confirmed several of Webb's key points. The CIA Inspector General's report ultimately supported Webb's thesis that the CIA had worked with Contras despite drug allegations against them. The report acknowledged that the CIA had relationships with dozens of Contra supporters who were involved in drug trafficking, that the CIA had received reports of drug trafficking by Contra supporters throughout the 1980s, that in some cases CIA employees knew about the drug trafficking and did nothing, and that the CIA's chief of the Central America Task Force had said it wasn't just a couple of people involved in drug trafficking, was a lot of people. A separate investigation by Senator John Kerry in 1989 had reached similar conclusions years earlier, finding that Contra drug links included payments to drug traffickers by the US State Department. But that report had received almost no media attention when it was released. So Webb had been essentially right about the core claims. The CIA had relationships with drug traffickers, They knew about the trafficking. They did nothing to stop it. And this happened while these same drugs were devastating American cities. But by the time these confirmations came out, Webb's career was destroyed. Webb continued to defend his reporting. In 1998, he published a book expanding on the series, with even more documentation. But he couldn't get another job in mainstream journalism. He ended up working as an investigative reporter for the California State Legislature. On December 10, 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his home. He died from 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and police ruled it a suicide. The fact that there were 2 shots has led to ongoing questions, though the coroner insisted it was possible for someone to shoot themselves twice. The Dark Alliance controversy raises disturbing questions beyond the drug trafficking itself. Why did the major newspapers put such massive resources into attacking Webb, rather than investigating the CIA's drug connections themselves? Why had they ignored the Kerry Committee findings years earlier? Was this about journalistic standards, or about protecting the intelligence community? The crack epidemic had devastating long-lasting effects on Black communities: mass incarceration, broken families, economic devastation, trauma that continues to this day. And if Webb was right, if the CIA really did look the other way while drug trafficking happened to fund their secret war, then the US government bears responsibility for that destruction. Representative Maxine Waters called it one of the worst official abuses in our nation's history. She wasn't wrong. Even if we accept the most careful interpretation of events, the CIA knowingly worked with drug traffickers and did nothing to stop tons of cocaine from flooding into American cities. Webb's story is also a warning about journalism. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter who carefully documented his claims. But when he took on the intelligence community and major newspapers decided he was wrong, his career was destroyed. The message was clear: don't investigate certain topics too deeply, or you'll be made an example of. Today, Webb's reputation has been somewhat restored. A 2014 movie called Kill the Messenger told his story. Many journalists now acknowledge that he was unfairly attacked and that his core reporting was solid. But that recognition came too late for Webb himself. The Dark Alliance scandal shows how national security concerns can be used to justify ignoring criminal activity, how intelligence agencies can operate without consequences, and how even a free press can be suppressed when powerful institutions decide a story is too dangerous to be told. Chapter 10: Japanese-American Internment Camps. Democracy. Suspended. Let's talk about one of the darkest moments in American civil liberties history. A time when the US government rounded up over 120,000 people based solely on their ancestry, stripped them of their property, and locked them in camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers for years. Not prisoners of war, not convicted criminals, American citizens. I'm talking about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and it represents one of the most shameful violations of constitutional rights in the 20th century. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into World War II. Within a week, more than 2,000 Issei leaders of the Japanese American community were behind bars. These were community leaders, religious figures, business owners, people who had committed no crime but were arrested simply for being Japanese. The hysteria was immediate. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox blamed Pearl Harbor on the most effective fifth column work that's come out of this war. Except in Norway, even though he knew this was false. Newspapers ran sensational stories about sabotage and espionage, none of which had any factual basis. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. These were community leaders, religious figures, business owners, people who had committed no crime but were arrested simply for being Japanese. The hysteria was immediate. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox blamed Pearl Harbor on the most effective fifth column work that's come out of this war. Except in Norway, even though he knew this was false. Newspapers ran sensational stories about sabotage and espionage, none of which had any factual basis. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order gave the Secretary of War and military commanders the power to evacuate all people deemed a threat from the West Coast to incarceration camps that the government called relocation centers. Now, here's something that should make this even more disturbing. About 127,000 Japanese Americans then lived in the continental US, and about 80,000 were Nisa second generation, American-born Japanese with US citizenship. And about 2/3 of those interned were US citizens. These weren't enemy aliens. These were Americans, many born in the United States who had never even been to Japan. The process was brutal. Japanese American families were given as little as 6 days' notice. They had to sell everything. They couldn't carry their homes, their businesses, their possessions. The evacuees were required to sell their belongings in just a few days. So homeowners had to sell their houses, and business owners their farms, stores, and restaurants quickly and at huge discounts, often for pennies on the dollar. Think about that for a moment. You've built a life. Maybe you own a farm or a store. You have a home full of furniture and family keepsakes. And suddenly you're told you have 6 days to sell everything or leave it behind. Buyers knew you were desperate, so they paid almost nothing. Japanese Americans lost an estimated $400 million in property, which would be billions in today's dollars. Families reported to assembly centers, which were often converted racetracks and fairgrounds. The assembly centers were usually converted racetracks and fairgrounds where thousands of people slept in stables, livestock stalls, or in the open air while they waited to be sent to their assigned internment camps. American citizens were sleeping in horse stalls. Eventually, they were moved to one of 10 permanent relocation centers, mostly located in remote, barren areas: Manzana in California, Tule Lake, Minidoka in Idaho, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in Utah, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Granada in Colorado, Rowa and Jerome in Arkansas. These camps were built in some of the harshest environments in America: deserts, swamps, areas with extreme temperatures. The conditions were harsh. Families lived in simple barracks with thin walls and no insulation. Housing was basic, consisting mainly of tar paper barracks, and each relocation center was completely surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. There was no privacy. Families shared communal bathrooms and dining halls. In the desert camps, dust storms would blow through the cracks in the walls. In winter, it was freezing. In summer, unbearably hot. The government's justification was national security, the fear that Japanese Americans might act as spies or saboteurs for Japan. But here's the thing. No person of Japanese ancestry living in the United States was ever convicted of any serious act of espionage or sabotage during the war. Yet these innocent people were removed from their homes and placed in relocation centers, many for the duration of the war. Meanwhile, between 1942 and 1944, 18 Caucasians were tried for spying for Japan, and at least 10 were convicted in court. So the actual spies were white Americans, but Japanese Americans were the ones locked up. And here's another detail that shows the racism behind this policy. In Hawaii, where more than 150,000 Japanese Americans made up more than 1/3 of the territory's population, only 1,200 to 1,800 were interned. If Japanese Americans were really a security threat, why weren't they interned in Hawaii, which was much closer to Japan and had just been attacked? The answer is simple. The Hawaiian economy depended on Japanese American labor. On the mainland, white farmers and businessmen were happy to see their Japanese American competitors eliminated. The internment policy was also openly racist in ways that should shock everyone. Those who were as little as 1/16 Japanese were placed in incarceration camps. And one official said, "I am determined that if they have one drop of Japanese blood in them, they must go to camp." Life in the camps was a strange mix of trying to live normally and constant reminders of imprisonment. The government tried to make them self-sufficient with schools, hospitals, and work programs. Internees could work for wages, but the pay was insulting $5 per day. They tried to maintain community, publishing newspapers, organizing recreational activities, forming sports teams, and holding cultural events. But they were prisoners. There were guard towers with armed guards. There was barbed wire. People couldn't leave, and if they got too close to the fence, they might be shot. At the Topaz Relocation Center, 63-year-old prisoner James Hatsuki Wakasa was shot and killed by military police after walking near the perimeter fence. Violence occasionally broke out. At Manzanar, tensions over suspected informants led to a riot where 2 internees were killed by military police. These were Americans shooting Americans because of their ancestry. Young Japanese American men faced an impossible choice. The government that had imprisoned their families wanted them to serve in the military. Some refused on principle. How could they fight for a country that had taken away their rights? Others volunteered, hoping to prove their loyalty. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up almost entirely of Japanese Americans, became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. They fought in Europe while their families remained in camps. The camps stayed open until 1945. Even after the war ended, many Japanese Americans had nowhere to go. Their homes were gone, their businesses destroyed, their communities scattered. Some camps weren't closed until 1946. It wasn't until 1988, over 40 years later, that the US government formally apologized. The Civil Liberties Act provided $20,000 in compensation to each surviving internee. It was something, but no amount of money could undo what had been done. Entire lives had been destroyed, generations of wealth wiped out, communities permanently broken apart. President Ronald Reagan, when signing the bill, acknowledged that the internment was a grave injustice motivated by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It took over 40 years for the government to admit what should have been obvious all along. The Supreme Court's role in this story is also shameful. In Korematsu v. United States in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of internment by a vote of 6-3. It wasn't until 2018 that the Supreme Court clearly rejected that decision. The legacy of Japanese American internment is a reminder that constitutional rights are fragile, that fear and racism can lead to mass violations of civil liberties, that being a citizen doesn't protect you when the government decides you're the enemy, and that sometimes the worst violations of American values come from American leaders claiming to protect America. It's also a warning for the future. After September 11, 2001, there were calls to intern Muslim Americans. After various terror attacks, there have been proposals to ban immigration based on religion or nationality. The internment of Japanese Americans shows us where that path leads. Democracy isn't guaranteed. Rights aren't automatic. And the greatest threats to freedom often come from within, wrapped in the language of security and necessity. Chapter 11. The Move Bombing. When Philadelphia dropped a bomb on its own citizens. Right. This one is going to sound absolutely crazy, but it's completely true. In 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb on a residential neighborhood, killing 11 people, including 5 children, and destroying an entire city block. This happened in America, in Philadelphia, in 1985. I'm talking about the Move bombing. And it's one of the most shocking examples of police violence and government overreach in American history. First, let me explain what Move was. Move was a black liberation group, founded in 1972, by John Africa. It wasn't your typical political organization. Move members followed a naturalist anti-technology philosophy. They were vegan. They advocated for animal rights. They protested against police brutality and systemic racism. They took the surname Africa to honor what they saw as the birthplace of humanity. They were also confrontational. They would broadcast political messages full of profanity through bullhorns. They kept their children out of school, believing the education system was corrupt. They had conflicts with neighbors over noise and sanitation. The Philadelphia police saw them as a problem, and tensions had been building for years. In 1978, there had been a violent confrontation between Move and police at their previous location that left one police officer dead. Several Move members were sentenced to long prison terms. The group moved to a row house at 6221 Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia. By 1985, tensions were escalating again. Move members had fortified their row house, building a bunker on the roof. They were making noise complaints worse, broadcasting messages through loudspeakers at all hours. Neighbors were frustrated and demanded the city do something. But what happened next was beyond comprehension. On May 13, 1985, Philadelphia Mayor Wilson Goode authorized an operation to remove Move from the house and arrest members on various charges. What should have been a standard police operation turned into a military-style assault. The police commissioner brought in hundreds of police officers, firefighters, and city workers. They evacuated several surrounding blocks. They brought in massive amounts of equipment. Then things escalated quickly. Police began by trying to break down parts of the house with water cannons and tear gas. Move members shot back. A gunfight broke out. The police fired 10,000 rounds of ammunition. 10,000 rounds into a residential neighborhood where children were present. And then someone made the decision that would go down as one of the worst in Philadelphia history. Police decided to drop a bomb on the roof bunker to destroy it. They loaded C4 explosives and Tovex into a Pennsylvania State Police helicopter, flew over the row house, and dropped the bomb. The bomb exploded. The bunker didn't fully collapse, but the explosives started a fire. And here's where it gets even worse. The police commissioner made the decision to let the fire burn. He wanted to eliminate the bunker, so he ordered firefighters to hold back while the house burned. The fire spread. Row houses are connected, sharing walls, so fire moves quickly between them. Within hours, the fire had consumed not just the Move house, but the entire block. 61 homes were destroyed. An entire neighborhood gone. And Move members, 11 people died in that house. 6 adults and 5 children, ranging in age from 7 to 13. Most died from smoke inhalation or burns. Only 2 people escaped alive, 1 adult and 1 child. Think about what this means. The Philadelphia government dropped a military-grade bomb on a residential neighborhood, let the resulting fire burn, and killed 5 children in an American city in 1985. The aftermath was chaotic. Over 250 people were left homeless. The neighborhood was destroyed. The city promised to rebuild, but the construction was so poor that most of the rebuilt homes had to be condemned within a few years, leading to another scandal. A commission was set up to investigate what happened. The findings were damning. The commission concluded that the decision to bomb the house was reckless and unconscionable, that letting the fire burn was grossly negligent, and that the operation was poorly planned and irresponsibly carried out. Mayor Wilson Goode, who was Philadelphia's first black mayor, took responsibility for the disaster, but he wasn't removed from office and even won re-election in 1987. Police Commissioner Gregor Samber resigned but faced no criminal charges. In fact, no city official was ever criminally prosecuted for the MOVE bombing. The only MOVE member to face serious consequences was Ramona Africa, one of the 2 survivors. She was charged with riot and conspiracy and served 7 years in prison. So the survivors of the bombing were imprisoned while the officials who ordered the bombing faced no jail time. In 1996, a civil lawsuit resulted in a $1.5 million settlement to be divided among survivors and victims' families. $5 million for 11 deaths and the destruction of 61 homes. It's an insulting amount. The MOVE bombing is extraordinary in its brutality. How often does a government drop a bomb on its own citizens? The decision to let the fire burn showed a complete disregard for human life and property. The fact that 5 children died makes it even more horrific. But it's also extraordinary in how it was justified. MOVE was portrayed as extremists, as dangerous criminals who left the police no choice. The media largely accepted this story. Many Philadelphians supported the operation, believing MOVE needed to be dealt with harshly. The neighbors who had complained about noise and disruption didn't expect or want their homes destroyed and people killed. But there was enough hostility toward MOVE that the bombing didn't cause the national outrage it should have. The MOVE bombing has to be understood in the context of how black radical groups were treated in the 1970s and 1980s. The Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, and other organizations faced extreme, often violent responses from law enforcement. MOVE's confrontational tactics and black nationalism made them a target. It's hard to imagine a similar situation happening with a white organization. The bombing also raises questions about militarized policing. Why did the Philadelphia police have access to military-grade explosives? Why was dropping a bomb from a helicopter even considered as an option? The MOVE operation foreshadowed the increasing militarization of police forces that has continued to this day. For decades, the MOVE bombing was largely forgotten outside of Philadelphia. But in recent years, there have been renewed calls to remember what happened and hold the city accountable. In 2020, during protests over police violence following George Floyd's murder, the MOVE bombing was mentioned as an example of how far police violence against black communities could go. There's also been recent controversy over how the victims' remains were handled. In 2021, it was revealed that bones from MOVE victims had been kept by the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton University for anthropological study without the consent of families. The remains were only returned after public outcry, adding another layer of disrespect to an already horrific story. The MOVE bombing stands as a clear example of state violence, of how governments can justify almost anything when dealing with groups they see as threatening. It shows what happens when police are given military tools and allowed to act without consequences. And it's a reminder that children, innocent people, entire communities can be destroyed when those in power make reckless decisions. Chapter 12. The Gulf of Tonkin Lie. Manufacturing a war. What if I told you that the United States escalated the Vietnam War, sending hundreds of thousands of troops and causing millions of deaths based on an attack that never actually happened? You'd probably think that's impossible, that a democracy couldn't go to war based on a lie, right? Well, welcome to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, one of the most consequential lies in American history. It's August 1964. The United States is already involved in Vietnam, providing military advisors and support to South Vietnam in its war against communist North Vietnam. But it's a limited involvement. President Lyndon Johnson hasn't sent combat troops yet. The American public isn't particularly interested in a war in Southeast Asia. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer, was in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, gathering intelligence. North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached and fired on the Maddox. The Maddox fired back and pulled away. This attack definitely happened. It was real. President Johnson responded carefully. He didn't escalate. He just ordered the Maddox to continue its mission with additional support. The USS Turner Joy joined the Maddox, and both ships kept operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. Then came August 4, 1964. This is where the lie begins. Late that night, the Maddox and Turner Joy reported that they were under attack again. Radar operators said they detected North Vietnamese boats. Sonar operators reported torpedoes in the water. The ships moved to avoid them and fired hundreds of shells at targets they believed were attacking them. President Johnson was told that American ships had been attacked a second time. This was unacceptable. The North Vietnamese had attacked once. That could be a mistake or an isolated incident. But twice that was an act of war. On August 4th, even before all the facts were in, Johnson addressed the nation. He announced that North Vietnam had attacked American ships in international waters and that he had ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases. He presented this as a clear case of unprovoked aggression that demanded a strong response. Then on August 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The vote was nearly unanimous, 416-0 in the House, 88-2 in the Senate. The resolution gave President Johnson the authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It basically gave him a blank check to increase American involvement in Vietnam. Over the next few years, Johnson would use that authority to send hundreds of thousands of combat troops to Vietnam. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The war would continue for another decade, ultimately killing over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. Here's the problem. The second attack, the one that justified the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the massive escalation of the war, almost certainly never happened. Even on the night of August 4th, there were doubts. Captain John Herrick, the commander of the Maddox, sent a message just hours after the supposed attack, saying, "Review of action makes many recorded contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overage sonarmen may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." In other words, the captain of the ship that was supposedly under attack was saying, "Wait, I don't think we were actually attacked. It might have been radar errors and nervous sailors misunderstanding what they saw." But this message didn't stop Johnson. He wanted to respond to North Vietnamese aggression, and he wasn't going to let doubt get in the way. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara later admitted that on the night of August 4th, he was uncertain whether the attack had even occurred, but he recommended retaliation anyway. Over the years, more evidence came out that the second attack never happened. Declassified documents, including intercepted North Vietnamese communications, showed no sign that North Vietnam had ordered or carried out a second attack. Weather conditions that night were terrible, with thunderstorms that could easily cause false radar readings. Sonar operators later acknowledged they might have been hearing their own ship's propellers echoing off the ocean. In 2005, an internal NSA study was declassified that concluded the second attack did not happen. The NSA historian who wrote the study said the evidence showed that no attack occurred on August 4th. He noted that intelligence reports had been deliberately twisted to make it look like an attack had occurred. Let that sink in. The NSA's own historians concluded that intelligence was intentionally manipulated to support the claim that there had been a second attack. This wasn't just a mistake or confusion. This was intentional deception. McNamara himself later admitted that the second attack probably didn't happen. In his 1995 memoir, he acknowledged that the evidence was unclear at best. In the 2003 documentary The Fog of War, he was asked directly if the second attack happened. His answer, "I'm not going to say any more than I've said in the book." The Gulf of Tonkin lie had catastrophic consequences. The resolution it produced was used to justify a massive war that would last over a decade. The war tore apart American society, sparked massive protests, created a generation of traumatized veterans, and killed millions of people. And it was all based on an attack that never happened. The lie also fundamentally changed the relationship between Congress and the executive branch regarding war powers. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave Johnson, and later Nixon, the authority to wage war without Congress ever formally declaring war. This set a precedent that continues today, with presidents carrying out military operations based on broad authorizations rather than specific declarations of war. What makes the Gulf of Tonkin lie even more disturbing is that Johnson and his advisors knew the evidence was shaky. They pushed forward anyway, because they wanted to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. They believed the war was necessary to stop the spread of communism. So they took a questionable incident and turned it into a definite attack to get the public and congressional support they needed. This is how democracies can be manipulated into war. Take an unclear situation, present it as black and white, create a sense of urgency so there's no time for careful review, appeal to patriotism, and portray disagreement as weakness. And by the time the truth comes out, it's too late. You're already committed to the war. The parallels to other conflicts are obvious. In 2002 and 2003, the Bush administration claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda, justifying the invasion of Iraq. Those claims turned out to be false or greatly exaggerated. In both cases, a rush to war was justified by intelligence that was questionable at best and intentionally misleading at worst. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is taught as a textbook example of how governments can create support for war. It's why we should always be skeptical when leaders claim we need to go to war immediately without time for debate or checking the facts. Because once you commit to war, the consequences can't be undone. For the Vietnamese, the consequences were devastating. Millions died. The country was heavily bombed. Chemicals like Agent Orange poisoned the land and people. The war didn't end until 1975. When North Vietnam finally took over the South. The outcome that the United States spent a decade trying to prevent happened anyway. For Americans, the war created deep divisions that continue to this day. It shattered trust in government, giving rise to the phrase credibility gap. It led to the War Powers Act of 1973, which tried to limit presidential war powers, though how effective it's been is debated. And it left a generation of veterans dealing with PTSD, physical injuries, and a society that often didn't know how to welcome them home. The Gulf of Tonkin lie is a reminder that governments can lie about war, that intelligence can be manipulated, that public support can be created through deception, and that once a war begins, the truth doesn't matter anymore. You're committed regardless of how you got there. Chapter 13. The Kent State Shootings. When the Guard fired on students. Picture this. It's May 4, 1970. On a college campus in Ohio, students are gathering for a peaceful protest against the Vietnam War. Some are activists deeply opposed to the war. Others are just students walking between classes. It's a beautiful spring day. And then the Ohio National Guard opens fire. In 13 seconds, they fire 67 rounds into a crowd of unarmed students. 4 students are killed. 9 others are wounded. And America is forced to face the reality that its own government will kill citizens for protesting. This is the Kent State Massacre, and it remains one of the most shocking moments of the Vietnam War era. The context is important. By 1970, the Vietnam War had been going on for years, and opposition was growing. Anti-war protests were happening on college campuses across the country. Students were angry, frustrated that the war continued, despite promises to wind it down. On April 30, 1970, President Nixon announced the expansion of the war into Cambodia. This was seen as an escalation, and campuses exploded with protests. At Kent State University in Ohio, students began protesting immediately. On May 1st, there were demonstrations on campus. That night, protests moved downtown, where some windows were smashed and fires were started. On May 2nd, the Kent mayor declared a state of emergency and called in the Ohio National Guard. That night, protesters gathered on campus near the ROTC building. And it's still not clear who set the building on fire. Firefighters arrived, but protesters interfered with their efforts. The ROTC building burned down. On May 3rd, the National Guard took over the campus. About 1,000 guardsmen were stationed there, armed with M1 Garand rifles, loaded with live ammunition. There were scattered confrontations between students and guardsmen throughout the day. Governor Jim Rhodes gave a press conference where he called the protesters the worst type of people and said, "We harbor in America, worse than brown shirts, worse than communists." He said he would use every weapon possible to get rid of the problem. His words were inflammatory and set a dangerous tone. May 4 started with uncertainty. The university tried to ban the planned noon rally, but many students didn't know about the ban. About 2,000 students gathered on the Commons, the central grassy area of campus. Some were there to protest. Others were just walking between classes or watching what was happening. The National Guard ordered the crowd to leave. When students didn't leave immediately, the Guard fired tear gas. Students threw the canisters back. Some threw rocks. The confrontation was tense, but not particularly violent compared to other protests of the era. Then the Guard advanced, pushing students away from the commons. About 100 Guardsmen marched up Blanket Hill, forcing the crowd back. Students moved away. Some continued to yell and throw rocks, but they were moving away from the Guardsmen. At 12:24 p.m., without warning and without orders from their commanders, 28 Guardsmen turned and fired into the crowd. For 13 seconds, they fired 67 rounds. The students weren't attacking. Many were hundreds of feet away. Some were just bystanders. Jeffrey Miller was shot in the mouth while standing in a parking lot. He was killed instantly. Alison Krauss was shot in the chest. She died later that day. William Schroeder was shot in the back while walking to class. He was in ROTC and opposed the protests. Sandra Schuer was also shot while walking to class, killed by a bullet that bounced off something. None of the 4 killed were particularly close to the Guardsmen. 9 others were wounded. Some were protesters. Some were just students in the wrong place. Joseph Lewis was shot in the abdomen. John Cleary took a bullet to the chest. Dean Culler was shot in the back and permanently paralyzed. The injuries ranged from minor to life-changing. The most famous image from that day shows Marianne Vecchio, a 14-year-old runaway, kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body, her arms outstretched, screaming in anguish. That photograph became the defining image of Kent State, capturing the horror and tragedy of what had happened. In the immediate aftermath, there was chaos. Students couldn't believe what had just happened. Some tried to help the wounded. Others ran in terror. Faculty members rushed to the scene trying to prevent more violence. A professor, Glenn Frank, tearfully begged students to leave, saying that if they didn't leave, there could be more shooting. The university was closed for 6 weeks. Students went home, many traumatized by what they'd witnessed. 4 families were planning funerals for children who had just been shot by their own government for being on a college campus. The national response was divided, and this division was heartbreaking. Many Americans, particularly older and more conservative citizens, blamed the students. A Gallup poll found that 58% of Americans blamed the students for the deaths, while only 11% blamed the National Guard. Think about that. 4 college students were shot dead by soldiers, and the majority of Americans thought it was the students' fault. The victims were blamed for their own deaths. Vice President Spiro Agnew said that when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy. He placed the blame squarely on students and protesters. Others said the students got what they deserved for protesting. Some construction workers in New York City even attacked anti-war protesters in what became known as the Hard Hat Riot to show their support for the government. But many Americans, particularly young people and those opposed to the war, were outraged. The Kent State shootings sparked protests on campuses across the country. Over 4 million students took part in strikes. Hundreds of colleges and universities shut down. At Jackson State College in Mississippi, police opened fire on protesting students just 11 days later, killing 2 more. The shooting seemed to prove what anti-war activists had been saying all along: that the government was willing to use violence against its own citizens to silence disagreement. If they would shoot college students on an American campus, what wouldn't they do? Investigations followed, but justice was hard to come by. The President's Commission on Campus Unrest, also known as the Scranton Commission, concluded that the shootings were unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. But that was just words, not accountability. The Ohio National Guard claimed they fired in self-defense, that they felt their lives were threatened, but evidence contradicted this. The nearest student was at least 60 feet away when the shooting started. Most were much farther. Students were moving away, not attacking, and the guardsmen were armed with rifles, while students had rocks. A federal grand jury was convened, but it failed to charge any guardsmen. Instead, in a strange twist, it charged 25 people connected to the protests, though those charges were eventually dropped. In 1974, a federal civil rights trial was held. 8 guardsmen were charged with violating the civil rights of the students. The case went to trial but was dismissed by the judge, who ruled that the prosecution had failed to prove its case. The guardsmen were acquitted. Civil lawsuits by the families continued. Finally, in 1979, 9 years after the shootings, the state of Ohio agreed to pay $675,000 to the victims and their families. The guardsmen and the state also agreed to a statement of regret, though it fell short of an actual apology. The statement said, in retrospect, the tragedy of May 4, 1970, should not have occurred. $675,000 divided among 13 victims and families. Less than $52,000 per person for deaths and permanent injuries. For trauma that would last a lifetime, it was an insult. Kent State changed America. It became a symbol of government violence against dissent. The idea that soldiers could shoot unarmed students on a college campus shattered many people's faith in government. It radicalized a generation of young people and intensified opposition to the Vietnam War. The shootings also showed the danger of inflaming rhetoric. Governor Rhodes had called protesters the worst type of people, worse than communists. He said every weapon should be used against them. When leaders use such language, when they dehumanize protesters, when they frame disagreement as enemy action, violence becomes more likely. Kent State is also a reminder of how easily tragedy can happen when armed troops face civilians. The guardsmen were young, many barely older than the students they were facing. They were scared, tired, and poorly trained for crowd control. Someone panicked, started firing, and others followed. In 13 seconds, lives were destroyed. For the families of the victims, the pain never went away. Jeffrey Miller's mother, Sandra, became an activist, fighting for accountability for decades. Allison Krause's father tried to move on, but was haunted by his daughter's death. The wounded survivors dealt with physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Dean Koller, paralyzed by a bullet, spent his life in a wheelchair. Today, there's a memorial at Kent State. The university holds commemorations every May 4th. The site where the shootings happened is now a National Historic Landmark. But for decades, the university was reluctant to acknowledge what happened. It took years of pressure before a proper memorial was built. The Kent State shootings raise uncomfortable questions. How do we balance the right to protest with concerns about public order? When is it acceptable for the government to use force against its own citizens? What responsibility do leaders have when their words increase tensions? And how do we make sure tragedy like this never happens again? The victims of Kent State were exercising their constitutional rights to free speech and assembly. They were protesting a war that many Americans believed was unjust, and they were shot for it. That's the reality that America had to face, and it's a reality that should never be forgotten. Chapter 14. The business plot to overthrow FDR, a fascist coup that almost happened all right. This one sounds like it came straight out of a Hollywood thriller, but I promise you, it's real. In 1933, wealthy American businessmen supposedly plotted to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt and replace him with a fascist dictator. They tried to recruit a Marine Corps general to lead a military coup. And when it was exposed, almost nobody was held accountable. This is the business plot, and it's one of the most incredible stories in American history. It's 1933, and America is in the depths of the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt has just been elected president, and he's putting in place the New Deal, a series of government programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. He's regulating banks, creating jobs, programs, setting up Social Security, and generally expanding the role of government in the economy. A lot of people loved the New Deal. It gave hope to millions of struggling Americans, but wealthy businessmen and corporate leaders, they hated it. They saw Roosevelt as a socialist, maybe even a communist, who was destroying American capitalism. They believed the New Deal was unconstitutional government overreach, and some of them were willing to go to extreme lengths to stop it. Enter Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines in American history. Butler had served for 34 years, fought in multiple wars, and received the Medal of Honor twice. After retiring, he became a strong critic of war and imperialism, famously saying that he'd spent most of his career as a high-class muscle man for big business. In the summer and fall of 1933, Butler was approached by a bond salesman named Gerald McGuire. According to Butler's later testimony, McGuire represented a group of wealthy businessmen who were planning to organize a veterans' army to march on Washington and force Roosevelt to accept their demands or step down. McGuire allegedly told Butler that they had access to $3 million in funds, with more available if needed. They wanted to recruit 500,000 veterans, many of whom were desperate and unemployed, to serve as their private army. Butler would be the leader, the famous general who could bring the troops together. The plan, as Butler described it, was to create a massive veterans organization that would pressure Roosevelt to create a new cabinet position, essentially a Secretary of General Affairs, who would handle all the real decision-making. Roosevelt would remain as a figurehead, but this new secretary would run the country. And if Roosevelt refused, the implication was clear: force would be used. Butler was told that the plotters were inspired by fascist movements in Europe. They looked at Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, where strong men had taken power by organizing paramilitary groups. They wanted to do the same thing in America, wrapping it in the language of protecting the Constitution and veterans' rights. Now, Butler was a patriot and a believer in democracy. He was horrified by what he was hearing, but he played along, trying to gather more information about who was behind the plot. According to Butler, McGuire named several wealthy and powerful Americans as backers, including members of the DuPont family and other corporate leaders. In November 1934, Butler went public. He testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, laying out everything he'd been told. He named names, described the plot, and provided documentation, including letters from McGuire. The committee investigated and, shockingly, found Butler credible. In their final report, they stated that the committee received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country and that they had attempted to use Butler as a tool for that purpose. The committee couldn't confirm all the details Butler provided, but they believed the core claim that a plot had existed. The report mentioned several organizations, including the American Liberty League, which was funded by wealthy businessmen and opposed the New Deal. While the committee didn't accuse the Liberty League of directly plotting a coup, they noted connections between people Butler named and the organization. So, what happened to the alleged plotters? Absolutely nothing. Nobody was charged. Nobody was arrested. Nobody faced trial. The committee's report was largely ignored by the mainstream press. Some newspapers mocked Butler, calling the plot a gigantic hoax. Others simply didn't cover it at all. Why the lack of consequences? Several reasons. First, the alleged plotters were incredibly wealthy and powerful. Going after them would have meant taking on some of the most influential people in America. Second, the plot had never actually progressed beyond planning stages. Butler had refused to participate, so no coup was actually attempted. Third, there was a desire to avoid embarrassment. Admitting that wealthy Americans had plotted to overthrow the government would have been a massive scandal. The business plot raises fascinating questions about how close America came to fascism in the 1930s. Around the world, democracies were falling to authoritarian regimes. Germany, Italy, Spain. The rise of strongmen seemed like the wave of the future. Some wealthy Americans genuinely believed that democracy had failed, that what America needed was a strong leader free from democratic processes. There were open fascist sympathizers in America during this period. The German-American Bund held rallies with Nazi flags and swastikas. Radio personalities like Father Coughlin spread anti-Semitic propaganda to millions of listeners. Some industrialists, including Henry Ford, admired Hitler and Mussolini. The idea of a fascist America wasn't as far-fetched as it might seem today. Smedley Butler became a hero to those who feared fascism. He had been offered the chance to lead a coup, to become America's military dictator, and he turned it down. Instead, he exposed the plot and defended democracy. After the hearings, he continued speaking out against war, profiteering, and imperialism until his death in 1940. The business plot is also a reminder that coups don't always come from obvious enemies. The threat to democracy in 1933 didn't come from foreign agents or revolutionary communists. It came from wealthy businessmen, pillars of American society, people who believed they were saving the country from socialism. There's still debate among historians about exactly how serious the plot was. Some believe it was a genuine conspiracy that could have succeeded if Butler had agreed to participate. Others think it was more of a vague scheme that never had much chance of actually happening. The truth is probably somewhere in between. There was definitely some kind of plot, but how far it would have gone is uncertain. What's not uncertain is that Butler was approached, that he was asked to lead a veterans army, that the goal was to pressure or overthrow Roosevelt, and that the House committee found his testimony credible. Even if the plot was poorly organized or unlikely to succeed, the fact that it was attempted at all is significant. The business plot is largely forgotten today, which is unfortunate. It's an important reminder that American democracy has faced internal threats from those who believed they knew better than the voters. It shows that wealth and power can corrupt, that some people value their economic interests more than democratic principles. And it demonstrates that sometimes the defense of democracy depends on individuals choosing principle over personal gain. Smedley Butler could have led a coup. He could have become a dictator, but he chose to defend the Constitution instead. That choice, that moment of integrity, might have saved American democracy in its darkest hour. Chapter 15. Project Sunshine. Stealing dead babies for nuclear research. All right. We've covered a lot of dark history today, but this last one might be the most disturbing of all, because it involves the government secretly taking tissue from dead babies, without their parents' knowledge or consent, all in the name of studying nuclear fallout. This is Project Sunshine, and it represents one of the most grotesque violations of human dignity and parental rights in American history. Let's set the scene. It's the 1950s and early 1960s, the height of the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union are carrying out hundreds of nuclear weapons tests, many of them atmospheric tests that release radioactive fallout into the environment. Scientists are concerned about the long-term health effects of this fallout, particularly the radioactive isotope strontium-90. Strontium-90 is nasty stuff. It's chemically similar to calcium, which means when it enters the body, it gets absorbed into bones and teeth. It stays radioactive for decades, and children, whose bones are still growing, are especially likely to absorb it. Scientists wanted to measure how much strontium-90 was building up in human bodies. They particularly wanted to study children because they were the most at risk. But how do you measure radioactive isotopes in bones? Well, you need bone samples. And the best bone samples come from cadavers. Enter Project Sunshine, a classified Atomic Energy Commission program launched in 1953. The project's goal was to collect tissue samples, particularly bone samples, from deceased children around the world to measure strontium-90 levels. Now, you might think, okay, that sounds like legitimate scientific research. If they got proper consent from parents and handled the remains respectfully, maybe it was justified. But here's the problem: they didn't get consent. In fact, they actively hid what they were doing. Researchers worked with hospitals, morgues and medical examiners to get tissue samples from deceased infants and children. In many cases, parents were never told that their child's body had been subjected to additional procedures. In some cases, tissues were removed during autopsies without the pathologists even knowing. Or doctors were told to get samples without telling families. The program was global in scale. Samples were collected from deceased children in the United States, Europe, Australia, and other countries. The Atomic Energy Commission had international partnerships to gather as much data as possible. We're talking about thousands of tissue samples collected over years. In some instances, entire bodies of deceased infants were shipped to laboratories for study. Parents who had just lost a baby were told nothing. They buried their children, never knowing that tissue had been removed, or that the body had been used for government research. The methods used to get samples were sometimes shockingly uncaring. There are documented cases where doctors were told to focus on certain types of deaths, like stillbirths or infant deaths, because those samples would be particularly useful. Some hospitals had informal arrangements where deceased children's remains would be given to researchers before families were even notified. The project operated in complete secrecy. It was classified, with documents stamped secret or top secret. The public had no idea this was happening. Grieving parents had no idea. Even many of the medical professionals involved didn't fully understand what they were taking part in. The scientific data collected by Project Sunshine was genuinely valuable for understanding the effects of nuclear fallout. The research showed that strontium-90 was indeed building up in children's bones, and that atmospheric nuclear testing was contaminating the food supply. This data eventually helped push for the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned atmospheric nuclear testing. But the way the data was collected was unacceptable. Informed consent is a basic principle of medical ethics. People have the right to control what happens to their bodies, and that extends to their deceased loved ones. Taking tissue from dead children without telling their parents is a deep violation of trust and dignity. Project Sunshine wasn't exposed until the 1990s, when journalists and researchers began digging through declassified Atomic Energy Commission documents. What they found was shocking. Internal memos discussed the need to get samples without causing public concern. There were discussions about how to handle legal and ethical issues without actually stopping the program. One particularly disturbing document talked about the problem of getting infant bodies, noting that there was a potential public relations problem if the program became known. The solution wasn't to get proper consent. It was to be more secretive. When Project Sunshine was finally revealed, there was public outrage, but it came decades too late. Most of the parents whose children's remains had been used were already dead. The researchers who ran the program were retired or deceased. There was nobody left to hold accountable. The revelation of Project Sunshine contributed to wider reforms in research ethics. It became another example, along with Tuskegee and other scandals, of why strong ethical oversight is necessary for any research involving human subjects, living or dead. Today, taking tissue from a deceased person without consent would violate numerous laws and ethical guidelines. Institutional review boards would never approve such a study. But in the 1950s and 1960s, in the name of national security and scientific progress, these violations were allowed to happen. Project Sunshine also raises questions about government secrecy. The program was classified not because the research itself was inherently secret, but because officials knew the public would be horrified if they found out. Classification was used to hide unethical behavior, not to protect legitimate national security interests. For the families affected, the betrayal is profound. Imagine losing a child, which is already the worst thing that can happen to a parent, and then decades later, learning that your child's body was used for experiments without your knowledge, that the government took parts of your baby, and you were never told. The grief and anger that revelation would cause is unimaginable. Project Sunshine represents the dark side of scientific progress. Yes, the research provided important data about nuclear fallout. Yes, it may have helped eventually reduce atmospheric testing, but those benefits don't justify the means. They don't excuse the violation of parents' rights, the disrespect for human remains, and the basic dishonesty of the program. It's a reminder that even in pursuit of important scientific knowledge, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, that ends don't always justify means, and that consent, dignity, and respect for human rights must come first, even in death. So, there you have it. 15 chapters of America's darkest history. From CIA mind control experiments to government-backed drug trafficking. From internment camps to bombs dropped on residential neighborhoods. From medical experiments on black men to tissue taken from dead babies. These aren't conspiracy theories. These aren't exaggerations. These are documented, proven, historical events, things that actually happened in the United States of America, the land of the free. So, what do we do with this history? We could pretend it doesn't exist, sweep it under the rug, and focus only on the positive aspects of American history. But that would be a mistake, because if we don't acknowledge and learn from these dark chapters, we're likely to repeat them. The common thread through all of these stories is this: when power goes unchecked, when secrecy replaces openness, when the ends are used to justify any means, terrible things happen. Democratic institutions, civil liberties, human rights, these things aren't guaranteed. They have to be constantly protected. These stories also show us that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices. Smedley Butler could have led a coup, but chose democracy instead. Peter Buckshin could have ignored the Tuskegee experiment, but became a whistleblower instead. Citizens breaking into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, exposed COINTELPRO at great personal risk. So here's my challenge to you. Don't forget this history. Don't let these stories fade away. Because the moment we forget what governments are capable of, the moment we stop questioning authority, the moment we accept that some things are too important to debate, that's when we're most at risk of repeating these mistakes. America has done incredible things, but it's also done terrible things. Both are true, both matter. And acknowledging the darkness doesn't take away from the light. It just makes us more honest about who we are and who we can become. Thanks for staying with me through this difficult journey. If you learned something, if this made you think, hit that like button and subscribe. And remember, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking questions. See you next time.